Localization. Who can read that first title? Which one is this still? Yes, it is. The screen's not fully displaying. Oh, well, it's probably only going to make a difference on the title slide. It's there on the title slide, I swear. Right here in front of me. So localization, internationalization, I'm going to probably use those two words interchangeably. Why are we here to talk about it? What are we talking about? What's the role of the toolkit? What's your role, the dreaded part? And then we'll have a little break where I tell some scary stories and then try to convince you shouldn't be scared. So this is what I expect those in the audience are expecting. You know, at a lot of conferences there will be other tracks going on, so this is the point where a lot of the crowd would look at me and say, this isn't what I thought you were going to talk about, and they'd go to the other track, but you're mostly stuck. Although I guess there is coffee now, so you do have an option. So yeah, I'm going to talk about what the toolkit does for you, what you need to do, possibly where the localization vendors come in, and I expect there are some in the crowd who will probably tell me I'm wrong, which is fine, unexpected. I'm not going to talk about machine translation, as nice as that would be. I'm not going to automatically translate your stuff. And of course, I'm not giving the one and only translation and DITA answer. With localization, with internationalization, as with just about everything in DITA, there are many answers to how to do it, depending on your comfort level, your tools, how you feel, you know, how much time you have. You can take a lot of paths to get to the same place with DITA. So I've already asked, I think pretty much everybody here is a toolkit user. Is there anybody here who's not doing translation? A few. Who here is still using DITA on a file system without a CMS? Oh.
With a versioning system.
With a versioning system, yeah, and that counts, yep. And of course, who here already knows everything I'm going to say? I knew Elliot would raise his hand. That's why I looked at him. He's not seen the slides, so he doesn't actually know everything, but I expect he'll know everything. And yeah, please share your own experiences. If something up here doesn't look like the process you follow or looks inaccurate from what you've experienced, let me know. I think that'll help everybody. The vanity slide, why am I the one up here? I've been doing it for a long time. More importantly, I really like languages. I do speak Russian to some extent. I haven't spoken it in a while, so it's starting to fade. I've taken other languages. They're fun. I like dealing with the issues. We in IBM do use the toolkit to publish into 50 languages, over 50 now, I think. So I have a lot of experience supporting the processing. And I also wanted to talk about this really because there is a lot of stuff I don't know. As I say, you may have experiences that differ from mine. We don't follow the path that most people follow inside IBM. So there's a lot of stuff I don't know. So I really am hoping that you'll speak up to correct me, to add to slides, that sort of thing. So, internationalization and the toolkit. What is the toolkit's role? What's our goal? It should be as easy to publish in French as it is in German. It should be as easy to publish in Russian as it is in English. It should be easy to publish content that has already been translated. That doesn't mean it's going to be easy to translate and to work with your vendor and do all that stuff, but once you get to the publishing step, it should be the same click of a button. And the same issues have to be resolved as they do for your native source language. As far as what we support in the toolkit, there are currently 48 listed languages and scripts. I say it that way just because we do support two different variants of Serbian, the Latin alphabet and the Cyrillic alphabet. And by support a language in the toolkit, here's what I mean. If you have a topic or a map that's in some language, the support should be the same as you get in English. If they're generated strings in English, we should have them in that language. The index should be sortable. All the little things that you expect should be there in that target language. Unsupported languages, you might get some of that, but you won't get all of it. Your content's going to flow through in an unsupported language, but you might not get an index. You might not get the fancy word that comes before your note. I've got a couple of links here for the list of languages we support. These actually probably should be merged at this point. We've talked about doing that a little bit, but haven't gotten there yet. For many years, the PDF support was really lacking in terms of localization. It shipped with, I think, about 10 languages supported. As I started digging into that, really for more of our production level use in IBM, I realized that some of those weren't as supported as they claimed. The index maybe didn't actually sort, even though there was a collation rule in there. Not all of the strings were present for the generated text. But at this point, I've tried to bring it up to speed. And so with 2.3, the lists are pretty much equivalent. The only real difference at this point is that HTML is set up to actually define some variants. So those of you who deal with French probably are aware that there's Canadian French, French, Belgian French, Swiss French, all these different variants. We actually have templates in place to support all of those as individual sets of languages, individual locales. They don't actually differ because the words we're printing as generated text are pretty basic. Those are all equivalent as shipped. Any questions so far? You're going to ask me why your native language isn't supported? Does anybody here speak a language that isn't supported? Does anybody here speak? Okay. I think that's a yes. So how does your localized content differ from your maybe your native language? Many of you probably know this. Of course, there's fonts. You may need a different font to print a different script in particular. The different variants of the Asian languages, you can use a single font that'll print them all, but they don't quite look right. Typically, if you're publishing to variants of Chinese plus Japanese plus Korean, you want to switch up the fonts a little bit. Of course, there's the generated text, which I'll give some examples of later. But, a lot of these things, they're issues for your native language content. I'm probably going to slip and say English, but I don't want to assume everybody's writing in English as their native language, but I'll probably slip up and say that just because that's what I'm used to. So yeah, for us, these are definitely issues in English as well, but they're the same issues you will get in localized content. Anything I'm missing? I mean, I know there are some in this crowd who will say, I already have too many words on this slide, and so it's good that I didn't list anything else, but, oh, okay. So about fonts. Fonts are complex. You probably know this, but if you don't, I've got a link here to a book that, yeah, I actually read a book about fonts. It was pretty cool, pretty interesting. It goes into the history and the difficulty that used to exist with creating them, and to some extent no longer does, but they're complex. With HTML output, typically the CSS that we ship just defaults to whatever the browser's using, you're going to get. So if you want to change that, change your CSS, and you can get sorry, a whole string of fonts. PDF is kind of peculiar. It's got a weird process that I know Jarno hates and keeps wanting to get rid of, where it goes through your content and really analyzes every character in your content and then decides from a predetermined list what font should this character use. And so it splits things up really oddly in the output and then sets the fonts. So you can set your own fonts there, you can change that. Or Jarno's got a blog post about why that's a bad idea, and there are cases for it, very unusual cases, I think, but there are better ways to do it. Font configuration in PDF too. Generated text or headings. Is anybody here not familiar with that idea? You all know what that is? Perfect. You can skip this slide, except I need to make this talk last longer unless I really want George to come up and complain. So yeah, here's the generated text. For those at home, I'm assuming some of you don't know what it is. There we go. What to do next is generated for a post-rec tag, and the task topics related reference is also generated. Other items handled by the toolkit. Index sorting is a goofy one. That's one where I actually discovered that I think some of the languages we claim to support in PDF for years weren't actually collating the index properly. They were just using an English sort, or they were not putting out headings. I'm not sure how that ended up. But at this point, with DITA-OT 2.3, for all of the listed languages, we should support index collation, headings to go along with every letter. It should work properly. With two exceptions, Japanese and Chinese, the sorts do not work at present. I know Elliot's raising his hand. I expected him to do so at this point. Again, he knows everything I'm going to say. Yeah, so as shipped in 2.3 and 2.4, Japanese and Chinese index sorting does not work. Or rather, it uses the Unicode sort, but then it doesn't do any collation to place headings. There are licensed alternatives from Antenna House. There is also an open source one, but it's a really peculiar license, so that if you use the open source one that I've seen, not the one Elliot's about to tell me about, the one that I've seen out there, if you use their sort for the index, part of the license terms also say that in whatever PDF you generate from it, you have to tell them, you have to say that you used this little sort routine. So in your professional documentation for your product, there would have to be a note that says, when I publish in Chinese, I use this weird little oddly licensed program. So Elliot, you want to add in your recent work?
It will be good to speak
Good
on
point.
the microphone. And if you have questions, you can come in from here. There are 2 microphones, and you can just pick one and speak.
So I'm in the process of putting together a new library, open source plugin for the toolkit that provides complete collation support for simplified Chinese and general localization support for collation. It'll do correct collation in every language, but in particular, it does correct collation for simplified Chinese, taking advantage of an open source Chinese dictionary that didn't exist in the past. And so this I'm just getting the documentation in place in order to make it available. The code works today.
Does it handle traditional Chinese or Japanese?
Well, Japanese you can't handle, right? It's not actually possible to automate the collation of Japanese.
Okay.
Right, which we could go into at some length if you wanted to. And traditional Chinese, the Unicode collation order pretty much gives you the right answer. Simplified Chinese is really the only language for which automated collation is possible but difficult, but requires a dictionary. Every other language, you just have a static collation, except for Japanese, where you have to have authored sort keys.
Okay.
So, and the plugin that I'm making, I mean, it doesn't require a change to the Open Toolkit to use, but it requires configuration changes. At some point, Yarno permitting, we may integrate that with the base Open Toolkit.
So does it make use of the stuff that I've been doing over the last few years? Or does it now bypass that entirely?
I'm not sure.
In which case I may dump a coffee on you later.
Well, it probably bypasses everything you've done. Yes, probably,
Yeah.
yes.
Okay, watch out.
I've been meaning to ask you about that, so
Yeah.
we just haven't had a chance to talk. All right.
Another issue that the toolkit generally handles is directionality. We do have a list of languages for which the default output in HTML and PDF will show up as right to left. Not all of those would qualify as supported languages. Thanks to Radu, I think a year or so ago, we updated the list to just a long list of languages that are known to be right to left. Many of them we do not otherwise support. We don't have the generated text. We don't have the index sorting. So if you have content in any of those languages, it's going to come out the right direction. There is also a directionality attribute in the DITA source that will let you override or reset direction. So once again, a reminder that we don't actually translate your content unless Yarno's got something secret in his jetpack over there, which would be really cool. So there are a whole lot of best practices for writing content in DITA and not in DITA for translation. I'm not going to talk about those, with one exception, because it really ticked me off a couple weeks ago. Don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. Yeah, has anybody done this? Has anybody else want coffee dumped over them? No. Has anybody seen this sort of thing? Yeah, I'll explain it. Okay, we've got a few people raising their hands. Yeah, this is a keyword that uses a conref, so a reused phrase. I saw this in content just a couple of weeks ago with somebody strenuously defending its use. And they had something like this. It wasn't this sentence. They didn't actually show me what their content was, but they were complaining that I didn't allow it. So the reused word in this case could be something like the word thing. So when that resolves, because they've added an S immediately adjacent to their reused word. In published content, this will look like the sentence, updates to your things are required in the following circumstances. I've got something in place inside of our processing in IBM that looks for this. Basically, whenever resolving conref, it just looks for an immediately adjacent S or ES or apostrophe S or ING to see if somebody's really going crazy. Because our translation centers were getting this in content and they can't work with it. In most languages, they can't work with it. And so I generate an error saying, you should redo this. And yeah, I had somebody coming to me just a couple of weeks ago saying, we don't publish our content for translation, therefore this message is invalid, therefore let me turn it off, get rid of it, this is dumb. And at that point I had to point out, it's in there because this messes with translation. In most languages, I again have to say. But it can mess with English as well. The example here, if you change the word to process, and you forget to go through and change your S to an ES, you've got a broken sentence. If you translate to most languages, most of you do some sort of translation, might know, or I guess in a European crowd, there's probably a pretty healthy number of people who are bilingual here. You know that word endings change, and they don't always follow the English rules for some reason. Yeah. Yeah, it's crazy, yeah. Yeah, so it breaks, and I have had people complain. I'm translating to Spanish, and it still works. Look at this specific example; it still works, and I have to shake my head. That's why I say in most languages, and probably safe to say in all languages, in most cases, it's going to break. Yes.
In some languages, even including excluding the your in that thing will break translation.
Yes.
Because
Yeah.
that word depends on the word that's behind it.
So as Yang's pointing out, even the word your there is potentially going to break. That's true. And this really isn't a great example of a sentence in general for translation because, it's got a noun that's reused on its own. And in many languages, the modifier on the noun is going to change based on context. And, how the noun is declined is going to change based on context. So yeah, this would be a bad sentence in many cases, but it's a specific type that I saw recently. And yeah, again, there are lots of best practices for writing for translation. Another one would probably say, just don't do this in general. But, so I had to mention it because, people, goodness. So assuming the content is correct, you're left with a bunch of things that you have to do. You have to choose. And again, most of these apply to your original language. These are probably things you're going to have to go through when you're publishing in English or German, if that's your native source language. You have to figure out what font you want. You may not want the default font, as nice as defaults usually are. I suspect there are some people in this crowd who use the note element and they don't like the word note to appear. Even in English, they want it to say, look at this! Did I wake anyone up? No. Okay. So there are cases where you want to change the defaults. You want to extend with your own strings that may not be part of the core because you publish with other generated text. And I've been told most localization vendors just expect this. And this is where, again, I don't work with a normal process, and so I don't know what's normally expected. But and a tip, if you have your own strings, put them in a string variable file. Don't put them in your style sheets. It's always easier for translation to work with them if they're in variable files. And hyphenation, you may need to update your process to support automatic hyphenation in PDF, something like that. I know we do that. It works in Antenna House. It doesn't work in FOP, for example. What happens if you need to add a language we don't support? Lee looked shocked by that. You shocked that we don't support Welsh yet? So,
It's not an important comment.
well, Lee was simply commenting that she's been studying Welsh because it's one of the most important languages in the world, and she's shocked and offended that we don't support. Okay, well, that's not quite what was said. Yeah, so what happens if you need a language like this? Well, you need to translate the default strings. There are two sets of default strings in the toolkit for historical reasons. They didn't used to interact, now they do. So in your PDF process, you can pull from the PDF strings as well as the core ones that have always been there. In HTML, you can pull from the core as well as PDF. So they all work together now. They're still separate for historical reasons, but hopefully we can merge those. Yeah, and again, the tip, if you are doing this, try to put your stuff in a plugin. Put your new strings in a plugin so that you will not be broken by upgrades to the toolkit. You can switch between versions, share your extensions. If the index sorting is needed, well, I was going to say tell you how to do it, but apparently Elliot's got something that will automatically support it already. Perhaps. So I'll go ahead and tell you. It can be simple or very complex. Basically, there are collation files. Depending on the language, it might be easy. If it sorts very much like English, you're probably going to copy the English collation file, make a couple of tweaks, and you'll be done. If you have a language with lots of accented characters, the collation rules say you have to explicitly list all of those, which can be kind of a pain. So I did create those collation files for, I think, 30 or 40 languages over the last year and a half. And some of them were very simple. It took me 5 minutes. Some of them took a few hours. So it depends a lot on the language. And if you're using an entirely new script, you may need a new font. And if you do create support for Welsh, Lee, in your own publishing, please contribute that back, send the string files over so that we can have some defaults in place. Of course, right now, in my own personal test bucket, Welsh is my test case for something that fails, and so if you do add support for Welsh, I'll have to change that, which will be annoying, but... So yeah, a quick caveat before I talk about the localization process. IBM, as often is the case, doesn't necessarily do what the rest of the world does. We've got a process that has been in place for decades, and it certainly has changed over that time, but we've had an internal process for a long time, and so we don't have a localization vendor that everything ships to using their software. Which means that everything I'm about to say on the next couple of slides might be absolute garbage, because I'm making it all up as I go. Well, not quite that. We do ship to internal translators. We have an internal group that sort of farms out responsibility for different languages. But it's all internal as far as we see. I think it does sometimes get farmed out to external vendors. So with that in mind, this is where I really hope that people might speak up to correct me. Localization vendors' role in the toolkit context. You know, this doesn't describe everything they do. This doesn't describe how you're going to write contracts with them, for example. Obviously, their role is to translate your content, probably to validate the output, make sure it works. I've ran this by a couple of people for review first, and it was pointed out that some of the tools out there, the localization tools, will require 100% markup equivalence between your source and target, because that enables them to do all sorts of tracking back to the native language. So if you have a phrase inside of a paragraph in English, you'll need that same phrase somewhere inside the same paragraph for your target language. And I think most content management systems will then store your translated content. It's another place we differ inside IBM. It's kind of odd, you know, the big company wants control over everything, but sometimes we're totally freeform, and that's really something that we have left almost entirely up to the teams that own the content, you know, what they want to do with the translated content. If they put it in a zip inside of a LAN drive somewhere, for example, that can be their archive. So, bonus point time. I'll buy you a coffee at the coffee break if you can tell me what I'm missing from this slide. What else should the vendors be doing with your content or with your toolkit? Did I really get everything? Oh, Young. George, the mic.
There's a mic here. You can just come and take one.
It's a learning
Yeah,
process.
so if you want to ask questions, feel free to come in front, and we have two mics.
Sitting in front of it. I didn't see them. So
also, Young really hates to be in front of a crowd.
of course.
Of course.
Non-extrovert method?
Yeah, I was thinking since SVGs are allowed inside of DITA content since some time, and SVGs have text in it.
Yep.
And I know there's all kinds of support in SVG in rendering, like in the browser, that it picks up the right language string for depending on the browser setting, etc. So there is some translatable content inside the SVG. Instead of having SVGs completely localized as well, so you have like hundreds of copies of the same SVG for all those different languages, would there be any kind of technical solution where you could take advantage of having multiple language strings in the same SVG and then, you know, handle it like that?
I don't know. My first thought is that that would be difficult because you're probably going to have, say, an English copy of your content and a Russian copy of your content. And to have that work where you have the single SVG with everything inside, they would both have to reference the same original image. I mean, they wouldn't have to. The other alternative is you have two complete copies of your localized image. But at that point, you're not really benefiting at all. I know recently on a call with some of the localization groups within IBM, they were really excited about the prospect of trying to get everybody to switch over to SVG from our older EPS and GIF and JPEG, just because it is so much easier to translate them. I think in the past, they've often had to get Corel Draw files or something like that and translate the original source and then republish the EPS, which does not sound easy, and I'm sure it's not easy. Anything else?
We have a couple of questions via the webinar from Scott Hudson.
Yes.
He says, don't forget term abbreviated form resolution. Do these have to be handled differently if the terms are translated?
Abbreviated form resolution with translation, sort of, yeah. That's kind of an ugly one. Processing-wise, really. So abbreviated form is an element that went into DITA 1.2. It was expanded in scope, I think in 1.3, or maybe the original. No, it was expanded in 1.2. It was originally in 1.1, maybe. I'm getting confused yet. The glossary topic showed up in DITA 1.1. In DITA 1.2, it was significantly expanded to deal with abbreviated forms. Abbreviated form, then, is an element you can use in your content, like a phrase-level element. It's a keyword specialization, or a term specialization, rather. It doesn't allow any content, and so it's simply a reference to a glossary topic. In that glossary topic, if your topic has an abbreviation, you know, if you want to spell out DITA the first time and then every time after that use the abbreviation DITA, the abbreviated form element is intended to support that, so that the first time it's resolved, you get the full Darwin information typing architecture. Every time after that, you get whatever you have in the topic as the abbreviation, which is generally going to be, you know, DITA. Where that runs into trouble with localization, of course, is that many languages will not have the same abbreviation that we have in English. Again, what are they thinking? Yeah, so if your target language doesn't have an abbreviation, you will still need to translate that glossary topic. You're going to have to leave the abbreviation field empty because there isn't one. And at that point, processing should recognize, you know, I don't have an abbreviated version of this. I should display the long version.
One more question from again from Scott. Multi-language multimedia, audio, video for HTML? Question mark.
Probably.
Oh, as what's missing here?
Yeah, I guess so.
Yeah, audio, video. That's true. Yeah, I don't know how that is handled. I haven't had to deal with that. But I would imagine it's going to be, in a sense, similar to other media like the SVG. If they are able to translate it, then they're going to have a version that is in the original language and a version that's in the target language. And then it's referenced the same way from your content. That's my suspicion. Anybody want to tell me I'm wrong? Really, I want somebody to tell me I'm wrong here. I'm so used to that at home with my kids. I'm feeling, you know, I'm missing my kids. I want someone to tell me I'm wrong.
You're wrong.
Thank you, Elliot. Always to be relied on for that sort of helpful thing. Okay. So, should you be scared of internationalization? I hope everybody here recognizes that I-18, and I forgot to mention that back on my title slide. Does anybody here not know what that is an abbreviation for? It seems, okay, we've got some in the crowd don't know. That's an abbreviation commonly found I've seen it with internationalization, localization, I've also seen it with accessibility. It's a shorthand to say, you've dropped 18 letters from the middle of this really long word. Which is, yeah, so that's all. Which I should have pointed that out earlier because I did that on my title slide with things and I was so proud. That was like the only reason I wanted to do this talk was so that I could use that title, and then I forgot to point it out. Anyway, should you be scared of internationalization? No. And if you don't recognize it, that's a whole lot of no's. I didn't forget it. I ran out of space. Okay, so but I've heard it scary. I've heard it scary. So I'm going to tell a couple of stories here, just because actually I have no idea how much time I have because the clock doesn't appear on here. Anybody want to fill me in? How close are we to the? 15 minutes. Okay, we're fine then. Okay, so what about those stories? So this is quite a nice image of the Tucson sunset that I found. I use that because years ago, I think it was probably in 2001, because it was back before, just before the tech crash, I think. I got a call from a team in Tucson, in IBM, and they said that, you know, typically the process at the time was you send your English content to our central file management, they farm it out to translators, translators translate, validate, they return the published stuff. And so somebody gets back a zip with their published localized HTML, their published localized PDF, that sort of thing. So this team in Tucson got back source files that had been translated. They didn't get back the output, and they looked at them and they freaked out. They did not know what to do. And without talking to me first, they got permission from their management chain to fly me to Tucson for a week to help them publish their localized content. Everything had already been validated by the translators. The source was all done, the translation was all done, they just had source files. And they said, we need you to come down for a week and help us through this because we don't know what to do. And when I got back up off the floor, I said, okay, well, why don't we have a phone call first? And I called them and I said, okay, we've got, you know, in our internal system at the time, SGML, we had a GUI called Work with the ID Workbench. You right click on your file and you say publish to HTML, publish to PDF. I said, you know how you do that for English? They said, yes. Try that on one of your translated files. And they did it. And it was done. And with that, I talked myself out of a vacation for a week in Tucson. Took about 15 minutes on the phone. So I use that really to illustrate how scared people are of translation. You know, I'm used to it by this point. I know the details involved. I know that the publishing aspect is straightforward. It should be the same in any language. But I know that to many, you might say, particularly among the monolingual in the US, maybe, it's scary. There are a lot of reasons for that, and we should recognize that. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this. That's one of the real reasons, not just the title. I know it's scary. I know that there are people who just, they see the other languages and they don't know what to think. And this, I'll give you a moment to read it. This actually came up last week. Somebody sent this to me. Yeah, this came up. We use Slack on our team, and somebody on my team posted this into Slack, and within seconds I said, can I copy that into my slide? Because again, that illustrates exactly the issues that are involved. People don't know what to do. Somebody else is handling your content, somebody else is translating it, they're giving you back something you can't read. How do you know it's right? Their process changes and everything breaks. So there's a lot of stress that goes along with localization. But at least when it comes to publishing, it should be straightforward. The issues you have to deal with are the same issues you should have to deal with in your English content. You shouldn't really be scared simply of the publishing process. Localization, maybe if you have a vendor that likes to come at you with knives. Any of those in the audience? Any vendors with knives? No. Anybody else have horror stories of localization that they'd like to share that I can add to my list? Yes, we've got one. Oh, here, get that mic.
The customer went from English to Turkish, and even with the caveats that we had given them, from the 2008 Writing for Translation that's out on the web sphere. The Turkish translation was completely screwy. And my apologies to anybody who speaks Turkish, but it set them back 6 or 7 weeks because they had to recode their original content. It was because of the way in which Turkish works, and it was screwed up with their conrefing.
Yeah, I expect some of that gets back to the bad example I gave and similar ones. So yeah, this does ignore the whole writing for translation aspect, which is hard. I mean, that's something you have to be aware of. If you know your content is going to be translated, there's a lot that goes into it, and there's a lot of thought there, and wise use of content. We've got another. Maybe somebody run the mic to the back.
It's tough to walk up to the table.
Yeah. I will also say, just while the mic's going back there, I've talked about the generated text that's in there. One thing I meant to say, and I forgot earlier, the strings that are in there, I gave the example if you want to change note to, hey, look at this. The strings that are in there are the defaults that IBM uses, basically, because we provided most of those strings. And so they are, generally acceptable strings. They're not what everybody wants. And when I say I've been wanting people to tell me I'm wrong, on our toolkit contributor call, just a few months ago, we've got a couple of CMS vendors on the call now, and they spoke up to point out to me that in their experience, nearly everybody retranslates those strings. They don't use the IBM defaults, which was news to me. As far as I know, they're strings, they work, but they're simply not what everybody wants. And so they're obviously things that I don't know about this, as I said. There are things that I'd like to know what works differently. But anyway, yes, go on.
I saw a translation company translate all the tags internally also. That was a nightmare.
Yeah, translating the tags. I have seen translators in IBM translate attribute names on rare occasions, which is one reason you want to make sure they validate your output too, because if they do that, they can't publish anymore. And of course, then they come to me and say, why can't I publish? So yes, some of this also assumes that you're working with a translation vendor that knows something about XML. Yes?
Dealing with a translation vendor that claims they know DITA files but have never seen one before.
That would be a problem. I'm not sure how to solve that. You deal with any vendor who claims that they can do something that they can't really do. That you're talking to their marketing, I guess. Yes.
Yeah, I think there are some solutions for that, basically, and I have a lightning talk that will show that. Yeah.
So George will answer that one later, when he also complains about localization, apparently. Any other horror stories?
Yeah, so from one of our customers has implemented the process of validating their English source for characters that look like the right characters, like not necessarily alphabetical characters, but like the degree sign or other, because the writers would just pick something from the character map and put it there because it looks good, but it's not the actual proper Unicode. And when it goes to translations, it comes up as something else completely that doesn't match. So they actually validate their source before sending to translation to make sure that they're not that they're staying within the boundaries of what can be properly translated.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of that. I imagine there are other reasons to check that now, because that's the sort of thing you can do for a phishing attack. And so I know that there are security tools now that might also catch that. If you use a Cyrillic O in the middle of a word or something instead of the English one, you can redirect. So yay, a lesson on how to hack and phish people. That's not what I was expecting here. Huh. That's not what localization is. Oh.
Since we're among friends, I'll share a little-known best practice in localization that I learned from a vendor. It's a really good idea to convert DITA first to RTF before localizing.
Wow. I'm happy to say I have not run into that. Getting near the end here. possibly interesting samples. Probably not for you. They were useful for me. I created a set of test files in all of our supported languages, plus Welsh, to just test all of the generated strings, like all the strings that can be generated by default, whether it's from PDF or HTML. So it's a book map for every language. And so you can see on the right, it's got just a clip of the Russian PDF. And so where there's an English title for my topic, it appears in the bookmarks on the left. But then for the table of contents, it uses the generated string. For the list of illustrations, list of tables, it's got the generated string. And then, of course, the index. And I expect most of you know, but if you don't, that's the word index, and beneath it, special symbols. So that's testing the English collation, or the index collation. But more importantly, it's testing to make sure every string is there. And this is where I actually discovered, when I did this and I put them together, I generated everything, and I was getting an error that I didn't expect from a language that's been supported from day one of the PDF toolkit. And it turned out that I think German was missing one or two strings that I thought we had supported German all along, but there were a couple of strings that were just not defined. Same for one or two other languages. So this for me was just a way to make sure that we actually defined all of the strings that we were supposed to for all of the languages that we were supposed to. At the same time, it does become sort of a way to just test your output to see, if you have your own PDF styles, you can run this and see that, the characters appear properly. If you've changed your font, you can see what the font looks like in these languages. So potentially useful set of test content, basically. It does for index collation. For everything except the Chinese, Japanese, and Korean, it includes all of the characters that could appear in the language, plus some that shouldn't. Like for Russian, it's got the special Kazakh Cyrillic characters included in there, just because I reused the Cyrillic character set for all the Cyrillic languages, just to see where they sort and make sure that everything works. A couple of links to further study on the toolkit. We do have monthly DITA-OT contributor calls. That'll be mentioned again several times throughout the day, I'm sure. Open to anyone, you just need an invitation. They're hosted by Synchrosoft. And we run those usually the first Thursday of the month. There are also doc calls that generally follow right after that. And then links to our GitHub project and to the brand new updated page at DITA-OT.org. And a few shortcut links that might be useful. Any questions, comments? Did I get everything wrong? Did I get anything right? Is anyone still there? Yang is still there, yes.
Did you get the translations of the little birds on the bottom of the slides automated? Or did you...
Somebody noticed. Yes, little birds. There we go. I didn't think anyone would notice, but it made me happy to do it. All along on the bottom, in the footer, there's been a translation of the word puffin because I'm a fan of puffins. So, yeah. That one I thought would be where most people got it, because that appears to be the common word across many European languages. I was surprised even Hungarian, which I tend to find one of the more difficult and oddly complex languages, uses the same word here as Polish, as French, as German. But anyway, yes.
Nice.
I owe you a drink for noticing that. Yes, in the back. I'll jump back up. That's in fact Navajo. Who would have thought that Navajo had a word for puffin down at the bottom there?
Hi, you mentioned one thing not to do, using a conref. Do you have some tips about what to do with key conrefs and conrefs, not to, to take advantage of translation memory and to help the translation vendor? Yeah, I do. There's a lot written about that. Of course, some of it might be wrong. I haven't gone out and checked, but yeah, I think the general quick advice would be, if you can reuse blocks, like full sentences, full paragraphs, that's going to be the safest. That's pretty much always going to work, because those will be translated as a unit. It's a segment in your translation. If you are going to translate phrases, there are a lot of best practices out there that say never do that. We use it pretty heavily in IBM for product names, which tend to be not translated.
I've heard arguments that I don't really want to get into here, just people saying, no, they have to be translated. No, they don't. No, they have to. No, they don't. And they're going to change. No, they won't. So there are different opinions on that. I think when you're reusing one like my bad example, that's basically, you know, don't reuse a noun phrase or a noun, because that's pretty much always going to cause you trouble. So yeah, the larger segment you can reuse, the better. If it's a small phrase like a product name, you know, make sure work with your vendor, find out if your product name is going to be translated. You may have trouble. Yeah. So that's the quick stuff. Otherwise, I know there are a lot of resources out there advising people how to do conrefs. And again, you know, there are a lot of ways to do things and get the same result in DITA, and the same is true here. And what you're comfortable with will vary. Yes. 1 minute. Okay, anybody else have another question?
No, if I said that it's only 1 minute, nobody dares to ask.
All right. I think that's it.
Okay. Thank you, Robert.